Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, YouTube, Podbean, and other platforms, and if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So as my regular listeners will know, I've been working on the beginnings of the colonization of North America. And as sort of preliminaries, I posted lectures over the past few months about Ireland, about West and Central Africa. The one about Central Africa in the years up to 1700 is on Patreon for patrons only. And then the first one in this series that I posted about an actual colony in the New World was the last one on New Mexico. But that's aside from a series I posted a while ago on Florida. So after Florida and New Mexico, the next European colony in North America above the Rio Grande was Acadia. And this lecture will be on Acadia in the 1600s, up to the years just before the war that led to the partition of Acadia and the transfer of most of the colony to Britain. But the era we're talking about through most of this time, this was a French colony. And Acadia is very special, and it's a topic I've been looking forward to. In many ways, although it was a very small colony, it paved the way for the form of colonization that would later take over much of North America. It was the first enduring New World colony created by a Northern European power, meaning from outside Iberia, and specifically this was a colony of France. And so this is fun for me also because it gives me a chance to practice my French pronunciation.
No accent. Perfect. Bonjour.
It was the first colony also in what is now modern-day Canada, and the first anywhere on the enormous landmass of North America north of New Mexico. And it was arguably, I think you could say, the first one in the Americas that started off primarily as a site for trade, not for conquest or settlement. Although that's a bit debatable, it's hard to pin down exactly what was the point of Florida. It was largely just a territory grab to prevent other European powers from getting a foothold in America. But Acadia was really seen as an outpost and treated as just a foothold in this distant land for trading, especially in furs. Although this would shift over time as a result of a long internal power struggle over the character and direction of the colony. So in a lot of ways, you can see kind of the fate of North America as hinging on this critical dispute over what kind of society Acadia would be. Now, let's pin down here, what do we mean when we talk about Acadia? So this term, Acadia, it's something that sprang up de novo in this process of colonization, and the term was and continues to be very ambiguous and ill-defined because the colony was created initially as a series of scattered outposts amidst a vast region where at the time no other European powers were present or anywhere nearby. Rather, the colony existed in the midst of a world of indigenous peoples with whom it had very close relations and often intermingled, and hence it did not have clearly defined borders, either socially or geographically. Now, early on in the 1600s, this term Acadia, or Acadie in French, was used loosely to refer to this series of French outposts or to the broad region that they inhabited, which more or less comprises modern-day Nova Scotia, central and eastern New Brunswick, a small part of Quebec at the eastern end of the Gaspé Peninsula, and most of the coast of Maine. So one could say that this was, roughly speaking, the coastal areas of the North American landmass that juts out into the Atlantic between the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the north and the Gulf of Maine to the south. But even still, it was never entirely clear how far this so-called Acadia extended to the north or to the south or inland from the coasts. This broad region lies between the northern end of the Appalachian Mountains to the west and the Atlantic to the east, and as we said, the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the north and the Gulf of Maine to the south. So it comprises basically a broad belt of mostly flat, low-lying lands with some small ranges of hills and low mountains. The climate here is humid and cold continental. It is cloudy and wet for most of the year, with warm, mild summers and deeply cold, snowy winters, especially inland. Although it's slightly less cold, but still quite snowy and often stormy along the coasts and in Nova Scotia. The land here is overwhelmingly forested. The forest lands are transitional between temperate and boreal, so they're composed mostly of conifers like pines and spruce, with some deciduous hardwoods like maple and oak mixed in. The woods here are rich in animal life, and the fish are very abundant in rivers and streams and along the seacoasts. So the coastline is actually what made Acadia valuable to the Europeans. It is a very long and complex coastline with many inlets and bays, islands and peninsulas. The largest single feature of the coast is the peninsula that juts out and forms most of Nova Scotia, and which is connected to the mainland just by the narrow Isthmus of Chignecto. And this peninsula separates the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the north from the Bay of Fundy and the Gulf of Maine to the south. So this Bay of Fundy actually formed the real original heart of the colony, and the French colonizers called it Baie Française, the French Bay. It's a large, narrow inlet extending from the ocean northeastward into the continent between the mainland and Nova Scotia. And the shores of the Bay of Fundy on either side are mostly very straight with few inlets. But there are rivers and estuaries emptying into the far northeastern end of the bay. Because of its position and orientation, and because of the straight shorelines with few inlets, the Bay of Fundy has the most dramatic tides in the world. On a normal day, the bay rises 38 feet from low to high tide. And these very dramatic tides make navigation and landing rather complicated. But more importantly for the European colonizers, the bay is surrounded by low, flat lands with a mosaic of forests, meadows, and tidal marshes, which in turn provide a wide array of food sources, from fish, birds, and game to grazing land for cattle or sheep, and fertile lands for potential farming. These include among them tidal mudflats and marshes that Acadian colonists in time would drain to create very fertile farm fields. Now, outside of the Bay of Fundy, on the ocean-facing coasts of Maine and Nova Scotia, the shorelines are much more rugged and rocky, with many fjord-like bays and inlets, often scattered with small islands. And this makes them very difficult to farm, but it does provide for many potential harbors for boats and ships, and hence for fishing and trading. And Acadia was originally a maritime society, aimed at conducting maritime trade before it became an agricultural one as well. Moreover, many of these large and small bays and inlets connect to rivers, which were the real arteries of the colony, connecting the outposts and settlements to one another and to the interior of the continent. The biggest river of the whole region is the St. John, which runs for more than 400 miles from the interior of northern Maine in a long arc through New Brunswick and down to the Bay of Fundy, and this provided a crucial link into the interior of North America. Also, important smaller rivers flow from the interior mainland through New Brunswick to the ocean on either side of the St. John. So immediately to the east of the St. John, flowing southeastward into the upper end of the Bay of Fundy, are the Petit Kodiak and the Memramcook. Farther east, flowing northeastward into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, are the Miramichi and the Restigouche on the present-day border of New Brunswick and Quebec. Other important sizable rivers are to the west of the St. John, including the St. Croix River, which is on the modern-day border of New Brunswick and Maine, and in Maine, the Penobscot, which flows into Penobscot Bay, which became an important French power base, and the Kennebec, which was often cited as the theoretical border between French and English territory. So if you do want to point to some line on the map to delimit what is Acadia, Kennebec was the border on the southwest. But again, things were much more complicated than that on the ground. Now, as for in the peninsula of Nova Scotia, flowing eastward into the Atlantic are various small rivers, the longest one being the St. Mary's in the far northeast, and flowing westward into the Bay of Fundy, there are the Shubenacadie, which flows into the northeastern part of the bay, and the Annapolis, which flows down into the southern end. and these would all become important in the colonization of this land. Now, of course, there were people for thousands of years in this whole region before Europeans arrived. So as of about 1600, there were three major tribes in this region. First and foremost, the Mi'kmaq, which occupy the core areas that became Acadia, Nova Scotia and eastern New Brunswick. And they numbered about 4,000 by the end of the 1500s. After going through a series of demographic disasters, plagues, they numbered, we can estimate, around 4,000. On the mainland of the continent, farther west, especially around the St. John River, were the Maliseet, who numbered about 5,000. And then further down to the southwest, in what is now Maine, there were several related tribes, including the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy. But the largest tribe was the Abenakis, who numbered about 10,000. Now, all of these various tribes around Acadia shared many commonalities, including closely related languages of the Eastern Algonquian language family. And later in the 1600s, these tribes and several others would join together to form the Wabanaki Confederacy in order to try to hold off English encroachment coming from the southwest. But when the French arrived, almost 100 years before that, this had not yet happened, and each of these tribes was fully sovereign and independent, but they coexisted peacefully due to shared customs and norms and ties of diplomacy and intermarriage. Now, how and why was this region colonized by the French? This can seem like a very strange target for European colonization, especially because of the fairly harsh climate with the long, deeply cold, snowy winters. But there is a logic to it. So for one thing, there's the simple geographic proximity. This is the closest part of North America to Europe, apart from Greenland, Labrador, and Newfoundland, which are even more cold, rugged, and forbidding. So this is really the first part of America that a sailing vessel from Europe would reach that is reasonably hospitable for long-term settlement. And there were precursors and forerunners to the colony of Acadia. For one thing, there was very likely Norse visitation of this region back in the 10th or 11th centuries, and possibly even brief settlement by the Norse. So no remains or artifacts from the Norsemen have been found within this region, but there are textual and archaeological evidences that suggest that they did reach this area. For one thing, the Vinland sagas describe traveling from Vinland down to a relatively warm and verdant land with wild berries. And furthermore, at the known Norse colonial site that's been discovered in Newfoundland at Lons-aux-Meadows, archaeologists have found that the colonists had stashes of butternuts, which do not grow in Newfoundland, but are only found further south, particularly in southern New Brunswick. So it seems likely that they traveled there, or at the very least, they certainly traded with people from that region. Now, these Norse settlements in America were eventually abandoned, and hundreds of years later, the next Europeans to actually try to colonize this area were the French. And what is now Acadia was briefly visited and explored by the French adventurer Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, but he mainly focused on the St. Lawrence River and trying to penetrate the interior. He only briefly landed or sailed around what became known as Acadia. It was then visited again sporadically through the rest of the 1500s, mainly by fishermen, who would sometimes set up temporary encampments on the shore to gather and preserve fish before sailing back to Europe. And they occasionally would also trade with Indians for supplies or local valuable goods. Now, what really attracted the attention of the French state by the end of the 1500s was the fact that some of these fishermen would come back to port in France with very fine beaver furs that they had obtained from the indigenous people in America. And these were far more valuable by weight than the fish and easier to preserve. They were more durable. So in the 1590s, the French government under King Henry IV took an interest in schemes to set up outposts in North America to try to tap into and dominate the traffic in fish and furs directly from the sources. In 1598, the Crown gave approval to a scheme to try to create a colony on Sable Island, which is, not that close to America. It's really just a sandbar out in the Atlantic Ocean about 200 miles from the east coast of Nova Scotia. And so soon after, 200 people, including various beggars, vagabonds, and prostitutes, were rounded up in Rouen, Normandy, and sent off to be dumped on this desert island. And these forced colonists soon mutinied, and the whole project collapsed, and the few survivors still alive were brought back to France in 1603. So Sable Island, we can clearly say in retrospect, was a bad target. It had very few food resources and no timber for building shelters or fortifications. It was also too far away from the mainland to trade regularly for furs or supplies or anything else. But nonetheless, in the following year, in 1599, two French adventurers founded a semi-permanent trading outpost at a site called Tadoussac in what is today the province of Quebec. And specifically, it was at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and Saguenay rivers, where indigenous people could meet seasonally to trade furs with French explorers. Now, this outpost lasted longer, since it was close to the actual source of the desired furs, and it could be inhabited temporarily for a few weeks or months, with residents obtaining food from the surrounding country before withdrawing back to France. Now, naturally, the idea soon presented itself of creating more permanent outposts on the mainland, which could be sustained permanently by hunting, fishing, or farming, while also obtaining furs or other trade goods from the sources and channeling them into French hands. And the French soon lit upon the region of the Bay of Fundy as the site for a more permanent colonizing project, which would give rise to the colony called Acadia. So Acadia would become the first actually permanent and you could say enduringly successful North American colony. But for its first 30 years, it was a very small, fragile endeavor with meager and inconsistent support from the mother country of France. It was very soon overtaken by other larger settler colonies to the south and west. Communication with France was infrequent and unreliable, taking at least 7 weeks each way. That's how long the voyage was, and that's assuming that there was no disruption or disaster along the way. And even when messages or directives did arrive from the mother country, they were often confused or contradictory, leading to administrative chaos. But nonetheless, the colony clung to its tenuous existence due to local initiative and most of all due to the support and cooperation of indigenous peoples, particularly the colony's main ally, the Mi'kmaq, who gained advantages through trade with Europe through the colonial outposts. And in a way, one could say that in this early time, Acadia was really more a colony of the Mi'kmaq tribe than it was of France. But this is a controversial statement. I've made a similar claim before about Louisiana really being a colony of the Choctaw Nation, and, it doesn't go over so well with everybody, but nonetheless. In 1603, King Henry IV of France named Pierre Dugast Sieur de Mons as the Viceroy and Captain General for all lands in America between the 40th and 46th parallels. Which, if you draw them on the map, that basically is the chunk of territory that we're calling Acadia. Now, Pierre Dugast Sieur de Mons was a Protestant French merchant, explorer, and adventurer from Poitou in west-central France. And the land granted to him in this charter included what the French called Canada, which basically is the lands along the banks of the St. Lawrence River, and Acadia, or Acadie, which was understood to be on the Atlantic seaboard below the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now, at this point, we have to talk about this matter of the name. Where did this name Acadie come from? Well, it appeared, as we said, in an early form in this charter that Henry IV granted to the Sieur de Mons. But where did it come from? There's much confusion and uncertainty about this. For many years, it was assumed that it was a corruption of Arcadia. So that's a Greek mythological name for a very fertile, sort of paradisal land somewhere in Greece. And it is true that this name Arcadia does appear on early European maps, basically labeling the lands on the North American coast above Virginia, both, English and French maps. So, it stands to reason that maybe Acadie was a corruption of Arcadia. At some point, the R was dropped out. But, what happened to the R? The French are perfectly fine with the letter R. Unlike modern-day residents of Boston, they pronounce R in their own way, and they have no problem with it. So what happened here? Well, if one actually looks at the early documents, it's much more likely that the name of this province actually derived from the Mi'kmaq word Cadi, which the French spelled Cadie. And this is an Algonquian word meaning fertile field, or the field where a particular plant or crop grows. And this word is found in many enduring place names like Tracadie and Shubenacadie in Nova Scotia, the latter one meaning place where wild root vegetables grow. And this charter that the king granted to Mons actually says that it granted him authority over a region called l'Acadie. So that's first word la, L-A, second word Cadie, C-A-D-I-E. So it seems to be using this Mi'kmaq word for fertile place or field. And probably this then was later mistakenly changed to l'Acadie, L''Acadie, because of sort of confusion or mistranslation, and then that was, of course, anglicized into Acadia. So probably from its inception, this was a colony being understood and defined in Algonquian terms. But anyway, that aside, the crown gave to the Sieur de Mons exclusive trading rights in this area, and in return, he was expected to bring settlers to populate, cultivate, and fortify the area, and to spread Christianity among the native people. Now, this was a bit of a touchy subject when it came to the Sieur de Mons, because he was a Protestant, and some merchants, such as in Rouen in Normandy, a major center for trading and fishing missions into the New World, they objected right from the beginning to the crown giving this monopoly to the Sieur de Mons because he would not spread the true faith in their argument. But the crown defended their decision on the grounds that committed Catholics were also involved in this scheme, and that he would bring Catholic missionaries with him to the New World. But this cloud of religious suspicion still hung over him. In the winter of 1604, the Sieur de Mons organized a voyage on 2 ships that set sail in April, one of them under Mons' own command, and the other under the navigator and merchant François Gravé Dupont from Brittany. They also carried with them the military commander Jean de Biencourt de Poutrincourt, the royal geographer Samuel de Champlain, who was from Saintonge in west-central France, an apothecary from Paris, and 120 other men, including mariners, traders, and laborers. Also with them were at least 3 Christian clerics, and these include a missionary priest named Aubry, and not much else is known about him, another Catholic cleric, and a Protestant minister. So the colony from the very beginning was religiously mixed, with a majority of Catholics, but also a Protestant presence. These 2 ships crossed the ocean in about 2 months, and they sailed around the Bay of Fundy, which they named Baie Française. In the autumn of 1604, they decided to encamp for the winter on an island in the St. Croix River, which they called Île Sainte-Croix, the island of the Holy Cross, and it's right on the border of what's today Maine and New Brunswick. There they created shelters around a little plaza, forming a sort of small makeshift colony. Before the winter set in, some of the leaders of this venture, including Poutrincourt and Dupont-Gravé, sailed back to France to get more supplies and to drum up investment and support for this nascent colony. They left behind them in Île Sainte-Croix, they left behind the Sieur de Mons, Samuel de Champlain, and 79 other men. Over the course of the winter of 1604-5, most of the men, all but 11 of them, fell severely ill, mostly with scurvy, a lack of vitamin C, which they didn't know how to treat. 36 of them died, so almost half. And according to one story that one sees often repeated, in this winter, one of the priests and the Protestant minister fought bitterly, and both of them eventually died and were buried together in the same grave, reportedly so that they could continue on their quarrels into the next world. Now, I haven't been able to find real confirmation of this from any early documents, so, one has to take it with a grain of salt, right? It's sort of a perfect just so story, but perhaps it captures the sort of climate of religious tension at the time. In the following spring, in 1605, the survivors of this harsh winter left the island and decamped across the bay to the peninsula of Nova Scotia, and they took with them building materials from the dismantled shelters on Ile St. Croix. They picked out a new site to resettle, and they chose a tidal river and estuary on the southeastern coast of the Bay of Fundy, which is surrounded by low-lying flat lands with meadows and marshes. And this was a decent site for fishing, animal grazing, hunting of birds, and possibly the farming of crops. And they called this new settlement Port Royal, the royal port. In the summer of 1605, Poutrincourt came back from France with 40 more men, and the colonists opened up a brisk and profitable trade with the local indigenous people, mainly for furs. In the fall of 1605, the Sieur de Mons left again and sailed back to France, taking with him some men and a large load of furs. In the next winter of 1605-6, 45 men stayed on at Port Royal. More of them, 12, died of scurvy, and most of the rest eventually decamped to the northeast, to Consolidation on the Atlantic, in the northeastern part of Nova Scotia, where the fishing was better. Meanwhile, back in France, Mons drummed up more support, especially from merchants, including in Rouen in Normandy and Saint-Malo in Brittany. And they formed a joint stock company called the Compagnie de l'Acadie. In the spring of 1606, Mons returned to Port Royal with men, livestock, and supplies, and he recalled the men back down from Conso to resettle Port Royal. And he formally granted to his lieutenant Poutrincourt a sort of fiefdom, basically giving him a special claim to rents within the zone around Port Royal. And this was more or less in keeping with traditional French feudal law, where there was divided and layered authority over land, and certain men who had seigneurial titles could demand rent or labor from the residents on that land. And historians have tended to call this arrangement the seigneurial system, granting lords or seigneurs partial rights over tracts of land to encourage them to colonize and populate it with tenants. And it's basically a makeshift application of French manorialism to overseas territory. The notion being that the seigneurs would provide certain common infrastructure like mills and communal ovens, and the tenants would owe rent or service to the seigneur. Now, presumably, Mons expected that Poutrincourt would take the lead in populating and colonizing this core area on the southern peninsula, while Mons would spearhead exploration and trading ventures in lands beyond. Over the course of the summer of 1606, Poutrincourt came back from a sojourn in France, and also returning with him were Poutrincourt's son, called Charles de Biencourt. So they had different names because these were seigneurial titles, right, related to their estates. So his son was named Charles de Biencourt, and also with them came a French lawyer and poet named Marc Lescarbot, and he was the first real writer in the colony, apart from Champlain, who wrote sort of chronicles of voyages. And Marc Lescarbot was very interested in the development and survival of a settler colony at Port Royal, and he wrote about the effort to create a self-sustaining colony in this fairly rugged and cold land. And he described, quote, digging and tilling my gardens, fencing them in against the gluttony of the swine, making terraces, preparing straight alleys, building storehouses, sowing wheat, rye, barley, oats, beans, peas, garden plants, and watering them. So great a desire had I to know the soil by personal experience. End quote. And he wrote boastfully that the rye here grew as tall as the tallest man. So the land here, if tended correctly, could yield good harvests, especially of crops like rye that are suited to the cold climate. So the colony had more than enough wheat, vegetables, and salt meat to make it through the winter of 1606-7, but in the following spring, the colony was thrown into upheaval when they learned that the French crown had cancelled Mons's charter, giving him a trade monopoly in Acadia. The reasons for this are unclear, and the justification that the royal government gave was that Mons had failed in the task of converting the Indians to Christianity. But, this was unreasonable. It was premature. The colony had just begun. Probably the real reasons were due to political and religious feuding in France. Mons had probably gotten too friendly with one or another faction at the French court, and other merchant adventurers got jealous and campaigned against him, and they used against him the fact that he was a Protestant, and they claimed to speak for the interests of the Catholic religion. So what was the fallout of this change? Well, Mons abandoned the whole undertaking. Samuel de Champlain, the main navigator and explorer, he abandoned and took a team with him and left to go to the St. Lawrence, where he then founded Quebec. Many others also gave up and decamped back to Europe, but Poutrincourt refused to give up. So in August 1607, he took a small group back with him to France to campaign for new support for the enterprise. They left the settlement in the hands of the Mi'kmaq Indians, who helped to keep it safe through the ensuing years. They had found the colony to be beneficial to them for trade, and they hoped that the French would resettle, and it seems that they protected and maintained the makeshift town that had been built at Port-Royal. In France, Poutrincourt successfully got confirmation of his seigneurial title to Port-Royal. So even though Mons, the sort of higher authority, was gone, nonetheless Poutrincourt was able to hang on to his title to that tract of land. And for 2 years, he and his friends campaigned and got new patronage, including from merchants at Dieppe in Normandy, including the governor and the governor's son. In 1610, Poutrincourt and a company of 23 colonists sailed back to Acadia. Also sailing to the colony with them were both of Poutrincourt's sons, Charles de Bienville and Jacques de Salazar, a priest named Jesse Flachet, Thomas Robin, the son of the governor of Dieppe, and a father-son pair of adventurers named Claude de la Tour and his son Charles de la Tour. Soon after, the priest Flachet began the first successful missionary effort in the colony, and he converted 21 Mi'kmaqs, including a major chieftain. In the spring of 1611, Poutrincourt's son Biencourt sojourned back in France, and then he sailed back to Acadia, bringing with him his mother, who was Poutrincourt's wife. And this lady, Madame de Poutrincourt, was probably the first European woman ever to set foot in the colony, and one of the first ever to live in North America. And by this time, it seems the crown saw the colony as increasingly promising economically and religiously. And arguably at this point, it became a victim of its own success. So for the first time, the crown started to involve itself more assertively, and it insisted on sending 2 Jesuit priests to the colony to take charge of the mission there. And this was highly provocative. So the previous missionary priests in the colony, it seems, were Franciscans, mostly of the Recollect order, who were known for their simple and austere lifestyle. The Jesuits were a horse of a different color. This was a very powerful and wealthy order, especially closely connected to the crown, very politically influential, and sending them to the colony suggested a much greater royal interest and involvement. And the colony and its supporters in France, as we've seen, were religiously mixed. There were Protestants among the settlers and among the backers back in France. And Protestants particularly saw the Jesuits as enemies, as persecutors of Protestantism and as corruptors of the church and state. So the Dieppe merchants, who were largely Protestant, now saw this colony as becoming an instrument of popish and Jesuit power. So they canceled all future support or credit for the colony and instead suddenly called in their debts. And the colonists now were left suddenly isolated and broke, without resources or credit in a faraway land. So what did the Poutrincourt family, who were now really the leaders on the ground of the colony, what did they do? Well, the son Charles, he saw that he had to turn to the Catholic party now for support in order to save the colony. And Charles won the support of a rich Catholic noblewoman named Antoinette de Pons. So she paid off the debts to the Protestant merchants and bought their stakes in the Compagnie de l'Acadie. She then handed her shares over to the 2 Jesuit fathers named Massé and Biard. So now the colony was more or less in the hands of the Jesuits. So when Biencourt arrived back in Acadia in 1611, the Jesuits tried to take charge, but Poutrincourt, for his part, rejected this attempt, and he then left for France to try to meet with Antoinette de Pons to renegotiate the terms of her patronage, but she refused to negotiate with him. Back in the colony, Charles de Biencourt squabbled and feuded with the Jesuits, and when Antoinette learned of this feuding in the colony, she then also completely withdrew her support. So for all of 1612 and the winter of 1613, the colony was left isolated and dependent on trade and support from the Mi'kmaws. Meanwhile, Madame de Pons in France decided to start a new missionary colony of her own, and she outfitted a company of 50 men and sent them over to America. In May 1613, they sailed into Port-Royal and forcibly took stores and supplies and also took on board the 2 Jesuit priests. They sailed down to the southwest and established a missionary settlement on what they called Île Mont Désert, or the Island of Desolate Hills, what we now in English call Mount Desert Island. And they established there a small missionary colony with a few settlers, which they called Saint-Sauveur, the Holy Savior. But this only lasted about 2 months. In July 1613, an English captain named Samuel Argall showed up. So by this time, the English colony of Virginia had been established, and they didn't want to accept French control of any part of North America. So they dispatched this adventurer, Samuel Argall, who attacked and ransacked the mission at Saint-Sauveur, and then took most of the men as prisoners back to Virginia. In November of the same year, Argall landed and attacked Port-Royal, and he raided what was left of their stores, burned most of the town, and the residents took some goods and possessions that they could carry and fled into the wilderness. They took shelter in the forests and then with the Mi'kmaq Indians, and mostly after that scattered to new sites around the region. Only a small handful ever returned to Port-Royal. In the spring of 1614, Poutrincourt returned from France, and he found at Port-Royal only a small handful of men. And he, at this point, simply gave up, sailed back to France, where soon after he died while fighting in an internecine war in France between the crown and nobles in Champagne. So, the whole venture could easily have collapsed in this point. But back in Acadia, Poutrincourt's son, Charles de Biencourt, provisionally took up command as the new seigneur. And the colonists were still isolated with no subsidy, supplies, or migrants from France. Nonetheless, they carried on and set up small observation posts around the coast to make contact with French and Basque fishermen who were voyaging around the area in order to signal to them and to trade furs for supplies. And this trade actually began to prosper, and it seems 25,000 pelts were exported from Acadia to France in 1616 alone. And new, more substantial and distant trading outposts were then founded, including at Cap Sable, an island off the southern tip of Nova Scotia, south of Port-Royal, and also other sites to the west on the continental mainland, most importantly at Pontarlier, on what we now call Penobscot Bay, in the coast of present-day Maine. And this one at Pontarlier persisted and developed eventually into a town called Castine, which still exists and is today the oldest European-founded town in New England. These outposts at Cap Sable and Pontarlier and other sites were tiny settlements with just a handful of colonists around a small stronghouse. They were isolated scores of miles away from Port-Royal. It was impossible for the French to defend them militarily, and for security they depended completely on alliances with indigenous trading partners. So the colony overall, as of about 1620, was a scattering of small, loosely connected outposts, mainly focused on fishing and trading, only a tiny bit on farming or gardening, and most of their plant foods were either obtained from trading partners or were gathered, like wild artichokes. Over the course of the 1620s, very few migrants came from France. Among them were 4 missionaries of the Recollect order of Franciscans. The European population of the colony was almost entirely composed of men. And so, not surprisingly, they turned for sexual and domestic companionship to indigenous women. There were many sexual affairs, so-called concubinage, and occasionally marriages, which might be recognized by the Christian sacrament or celebrated through the traditional Mi'kmaq ceremony. But the French clergy generally disapproved of these relationships, which they called métissage, intermixture. And so French colonists, if they did take Indian wives or partners, usually then withdrew from the colony with them into indigenous lands and communities. And these expatriates from the colony were called coureurs des bois, basically, travelers in the woods. Over the years, a large number of Métis, or families of mixed heritage, arose, and they could then further act as intermediaries between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples. The colony also relied heavily on indigenous knowledge for survival, such as learning how to hunt and fish in the environment, such as by running nets across rivers and brooks to collect fish, also learning the geography and how to travel along the rivers, especially by canoes made of bark or dug-out tree trunks during the warm months, and in winter when the rivers were frozen by sledges or snowshoes. And to comment further on the close links between Acadia and the indigenous people, especially the Mi'kmaq tribe, over time, by the mid-1600s, these two communities were totally interdependent and interwoven. For one thing, economically, through the fur trade, the colonists needed the Indians' supply of furs, and the Mi'kmaq depended on the colonists as their outlet to the European market. Also, demographically. So both communities struggled to keep up their numbers in difficult conditions. The French struggled as a small, relatively isolated colony with few immigrants, and the Mi'kmaq as a tribe that had been devastated by the massive pandemics of the 1500s and still suffered from disastrously high mortality rates even through the 1600s. So it was natural that each of these groups would turn to the other for marriage and sexual partners and would readily adopt new members, both adults and children, into their own community. So in effect, you could say these two groups were consolidating their demographic resources. And by the mid-1600s, there were so many ties of marriage and kinship that they almost, you could say, merged into one ethno-tribal continuum. But royal officials from France, didn't see it this way. They didn't appreciate this linkage and intermixture of the French and indigenous peoples. And they saw the Indians generally as savages, especially if they were not Christian, and they did not accept the legitimacy of any non-Catholic marriages. And Catholic clerics repeatedly complained to France, denouncing this métissage as debauchery in their terms. For officials in France and officers in the colony, secular officials, the question for them was how to make Acadia viable and strategically useful to the mother country. And there was deepening division over exactly how to do that. And in these decades, in the 1610s, 20s, 30s, the intensifying question was, should the colony, one, aim at expanding its trade network and rely on relations with indigenous allies, or two, try to build up a self-sustaining European settlement? And as for the main officers in the colony, Biencourt, it seems, harbored hopes for the second possibility. He wanted to build up Port-Royal into a large colonial town supported by farming hinterlands. But his main lieutenant, the adventurer Charles de la Tour, imagined the colony more as a trading network, and he, for his part, removed from Port-Royal and went to the remote fortress at Pontarlier, and there he married a Mi'kmaq woman and had several children with her. So these two main leaders, La Tour and Biencourt, they got along okay, it seems, on a personal level and stayed out of each other's way, right, in their two outposts far apart. Until in 1624, Biencourt died. And at this point, La Tour took over his title as the new seigneur, and he began to reorient the colony in his direction. He moved the headquarters down to Cap Sable at the southern tip of Nova Scotia, and he started a campaign of fortification, including building palisaded fortresses at Cap Sable and Pontarlier. Now, why did he do this? Well, it seems he wanted to extend and strengthen trading links, and he was worried about new threats to the trade network coming from both directions. So, as of 1620, English colonists founded the Plymouth colony, which for its part menaced the French outposts in Acadia from the south, especially Pontarlier, which was nearest and most exposed to this new English presence. In 1621, King James of England and Scotland also granted a charter to a Scottish noble and adventurer named William Alexander, who wanted to try to create a Scottish colony in America. And the idea here was that Alexander would gather adventurers to colonize the same basic area as Acadia, which they, for their part, called New Scotland, or in sort of fancy Latinate terms, Nova Scotia. So that's why, that name also stuck, and that's why we call this province Nova Scotia to this day. In 1622, William Alexander set out with a group of about 100 men to found a colony, and they found that they could not safely land and settle in Nova Scotia. The residents there were hostile to them. Also, there were French ships patrolling the water based in Quebec. So the Scots held back and instead remained in set-up camp in Newfoundland until 1629, at which point 2 Scottish privateer adventurers captured the French stronghold of Quebec. So now William Alexander made his move, and he sailed down to Acadia, and he dropped off a company of 50 men on Cape Breton Island to create a colony at the far eastern tip of the island. He then continued on southward and landed and took possession of Port-Royal. So at this point, the French colonists did not give up. Rather, they fled from the Scottish forces, but then regrouped. And after a few months, they were able to expel the Scots from Cape Breton Island, and they refounded the outpost as a French outpost called Sainte-Anne. In the following year or so, French colonists also created another new outpost at Miscou, on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, off of the far northeastern coast of New Brunswick. In 1631, La Tour himself also created another outpost at the mouth of the St. John River in southern New Brunswick, near the shore of the Bay of Fundy. So now you had sort of 2 competing colonies contending with one another for power and territory, despite their very small numbers, right? The French have basically withdrawn into the north, and the Scots control the peninsula of Nova Scotia. In 1632, the French crown secured recognition of their control over all of Acadia in the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And they decided now to finally invest in the colony and try to turn it into a serious European settlement like Canada, with a large population and a farming base. They appointed a new governor, Isaac de Razilly, who was a very influential man, being a cousin of Cardinal Richelieu, who was arguably the de facto ruler of France. So Isaac de Razilly set sail with a group of colonists and supplies and missionaries of the Capuchin order of Franciscans. They landed on the eastern coast of Nova Scotia, facing the Atlantic north of Cap Sable, and there they founded another new outpost called La Hève. And Razilly then proceeded to Port-Royal and peaceably took possession of it. He expelled the Scots, who mostly went back willingly to Britain, although a few may have stayed on and accepted French sovereignty. That's what it seems. Now, who was still left who was a holdout who did not accept Razilly as the new governor taking charge of the colony? It was not the Scots, it was Charles de La Tour, who was still ensconced at Cap Sable and controlling the outposts west of the bay. So they then had to negotiate, La Tour and Razilly, and they more or less agreed to divide the colony, with Razilly governing from La Hève and Port-Royal, while La Tour kept control of Cap Sable in the far south. And also, further, Razilly granted to La Tour a fiefdom or seigneurie over the region called Jemseg, around the lower St. John River in southern New Brunswick. So La Tour then crossed over to this new domain in Jemseg, and he soon built a fortress there on the river. And he used this title of seigneur formally, but like other later seigneurs, the people in the colony more often just called him a chef, basically the local military commander. They didn't necessarily like this sort of grandiose, noble title of seigneur. Now, just when it seemed that these disputes had been settled, right, the disputes with the Scots and between Razilly and La Tour had been put to rest, just 1 year later, in 1633, English colonial traders from Massachusetts Bay set up another trading post of their own to trade directly with the native people at Machias, in what's now far eastern Maine. So basically, right in the middle of that stretch of coast under La Tour, which he considered to be his sphere of influence. So La Tour attacked this English outpost and killed or captured several Englishmen. And the following year, the English mounted a retaliatory mission, but La Tour was able to repulse them and turn them back to New England. And Razilly, as governor, further told the English authorities that they may only trade with the native people as far up as the Kennebec River. So he was effectively backing up La Tour's position and his claim and drawing a sort of provisional boundary between the French and English spheres of influence. Now, through the 1630s, the colony enjoyed some growth and success under this power-sharing agreement between Razilly and La Tour. But they had very different visions and agendas, and this divvying up of territory between them marked the beginning of a persistent split which would continue for decades. And this split reflects a fundamental identity crisis for the colony. As we said, it was unclear what was the overarching goal and what kind of colony would Acadia be. Would it be one, a widening network of trading outposts extracting profit from furs and fish, or would it be a settler colony with a self-sustaining population? And to achieve the second, the colonists needed more people, especially those skilled in farming, and especially women, for procreation and to run farms and households. So La Tour, for his part, represented the older vision of the colony as a string of outposts, while Razilly represented this latter vision. And in fact, he had in large part been tasked with making Acadia into a settler colony. So in his first few years as governor, some migrants did begin to trickle in from various parts of France, mainly into Le Havre on the Atlantic coast, and some into other settlements with the intention of setting up agricultural enterprises. Razilly put his lieutenant Charles de Menou d'Aulnay, a nobleman from Poitou in west-central France, in charge of agricultural efforts. And he also supported another adventurer named Nicolas Denis in setting up outposts in the north on the shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence to export fish and lumber. So he did see value in these sort of remote outposts, but he basically directed them north. Whereas in the south, that was where the efforts were concentrated on settling more people and creating a self-sustaining agricultural colony. Now, Denis in the north brought in Jesuit missionaries to these remote outposts, and they began to replace the Recollects as the principal missionary order in the colony. In 1635, Razilly died, and now another power vacuum ensued, and the colony more or less split. So both La Tour and Aulnay acted to seize power of their respective parts of the colony, and each one retrenched by moving his headquarters. So La Tour retained control of the sizable trading network, including Cap de Sable at the southern end of Nova Scotia and Jemseg on the mainland to the west. And he also formally took charge of Pontargoed on Penobscot Bay. He moved his headquarters from Cap Sable to Jemseg on the St. John River, which was more or less in the center of this fur trading network and could command the largest artery leading into the interior. Now, Aulnay, for his part, this younger lieutenant, he proclaimed himself as the new seigneur and successor of Razilly, and he moved his base from La Hève to Port-Royal, which was surrounded by more promising agricultural land and could more plausibly be made into the center of a serious settler colony. And he went to great expense and took out large loans to fund the colonial venture. In the late 1630s, migration increased. Aulnay made yearly trips back to France and recruited peasants, mainly from his own seigneurial estates around Poitou, and then sailed to La Hève and Port-Royal, largely with the expectation that these colonists would settle and clear farmland for cultivation. By 1642, the colonial population of La Hève and Port-Royal totaled about 50 households, comprising about 300 to 350 people. The Port-Royal colonists built sizable houses and crafted furniture out of timber. They exported furs in exchange for textiles, iron tools, and ammunition. And the town had a sizable church with open grounds called the Common Fields. Capuchin monks also built a religious house called a séminaire and taught some local French and indigenous children. But the political situation was still ambiguous and unstable, so Aulnay faced major threats from his rival, La Tour, who still controlled the southern and western outposts with about 100 French settlers and many Indian allies. In the late 1630s, the two men began feuding over who was the higher authority in the colony, and both turned to France for backing. But the royal court named both of them as lieutenant governor, basically putting them on an even footing and leaving the feud unresolved. And so the two began fighting over how to use supplies and resources, very scarce supplies in the colony, and over how best to defend against English encroachment from the south. And this feud began to escalate into a civil war. In 1640, Aulnay sent a ship to Pontarlier to help support settlers there, but La Tour expropriated the ship and the supplies. Soon after, La Tour sent 2 warships to take supplies from Port-Royal, but these were captured and seized by Aulnay. In 1641, the French crown revoked La Tour's commission, basically finding him to have committed piracy, and they summoned him to France to answer for himself at the royal court, but La Tour refused. In 1642, the crown told Aulnay to go and capture La Tour and transport him back to France. So La Tour barricaded himself in the fortress at Jemseg and effectively became an independent renegade leader. In 1643, La Tour made an alliance with some English colonists in Massachusetts. And in August, they together made a joint attack on Port-Royal, killing 3 people and seizing the town's supplies. In 1644, the French crown declared La Tour to be an outlaw. And in 1645, Aulnay finally mounted a large expedition to oust La Tour. They reached Jemseg in April, and at this time it happens that La Tour himself was away in Boston, wheeling and dealing with his English allies. But his wife and about 50 men defended the fort. The battle raged for 3 days, and Aulnay lost 33 men, which, for such a tiny colonial population was a huge loss. But they finally did take the fort, seized its extensive wealth, and hanged several of La Tour's lieutenants. The wife, Madame La Tour, later died as a prisoner a few months after. As for Charles La Tour himself, he learned of the attack and fled to Canada. In 1647, Aulnay was proclaimed as sole governor of Acadia, with control over the whole colony except for the scattered outposts in the far north, which were entrusted to the charge of Nicolas Denis. Now, Aulnay tried for his part at this point to contain Denis' expansion. This was the one still sort of autonomous force in the colony that he had to worry about. So he tried to contain Denis' expansion, and in 1648 he seized and destroyed Denis' remote headquarters on the island of Miscou off the northern coast of New Brunswick. Meanwhile, over the next several years, settlement and slow expansion resumed. Settlers from the Osny and Saintonge districts along the coast of Poitou perceived that the muddy tidal marshlands around Port-Royal and to the north could be drained with dikes, and they began using this technology to uncover and create fertile farmlands, especially for growing grain. But in 1650, Aulnay's boat capsized while he was canoeing in the Port-Royal basin north of the town, and he soon after died of exhaustion on a mudflat, and indigenous people found his body and brought it into the town. So with his death, Aulnay left behind a widow named Jeanne Motin d'Aulnay and several children, as well as a large pile of debts owed to investors back in France, and another power vacuum. So in the ensuing months, Jeanne Motin, the widow, took up provisional command as the unofficial leader of the colony at Port-Royal, and she was supported by the Capuchin friars. But in 1651, hostile forces closed in from both directions, again, trying to take advantage of this ambiguity and power vacuum. So firstly, La Tour, who had been ensconced in a castle in Quebec, he learned of the death of Aulnay, and he got letters patent from Louis XIV in France, pardoning his past crimes of piracy and naming him as the new governor of Acadia. So he then set out from Canada with a force of several men and a lieutenant named Entremont, and he made an alliance with Nicolas Denis, who is still, in control of these outposts in the north and who is still resentful about Aulnay trying to rein in his expansion. So together with the assistance of Denis, La Tour arrived at Port-Royal with his men and strong-armed Jean Motin d'Aulnay into letting him retake possession of his old headquarters, the fortress at Jemseg. And he then installed his own lieutenant, Entremont, at Cap Sable on Nova Scotia. So Madame d'Aulnay was really only left with control over Port-Royal and some small farming settlements around it in southwestern Nova Scotia. Now, meanwhile, at the same time, Aulnay's creditors back in Europe, led by a merchant named Emmanuel Le Borgne, they organized and sent their own deputy to Port-Royal to try to take charge of the colony and to secure compensation for Aulnay's debts. And this representative showed up and briefly raided Port-Royal. Then in 1652, Le Borgne and the other creditors sailed with a fleet to the Atlantic coast of Acadia and seized the settlement at Chedabouctou in the far northeast of the colony. And there they took Nicolas Denis prisoner, and they then sailed down and destroyed the settlement at La Hève. So now you have Madame d'Aulnay's regime in Port-Royal under serious threat with their backs against the wall. So the colony was again in dire straits, and they could not effectively fend off the attacks by Le Borgne, especially when the political situation of the colony itself was so unstable and ambiguous. So at this point, Madame d'Aulnay and Charles de la Tour had to band together, right? They still presented potential threats to one another. They could potentially appeal to indigenous allies or to the French crown or to the English or to Nicolas Denis in the north, and this could lead to a relaunched civil war. And rather than, let that possibility remain while the colony was under attack by the creditors, instead La Tour and Madame d'Aulnay decided to resolve their differences and make an alliance. And in February 1653, they got married. So Jeanne, now Madame de la Tour, resettled with her new husband at Jemseg, and they apparently had a relatively happy marriage and several children. So the long-standing conflict within the colony was now basically resolved in old world fashion through a diplomatic marriage, and this was just in time to fend off a new crisis from the outside. So in 1654, Emmanuel Le Borgne and his sort of privateer compatriots attacked and took possession of Port-Royal, which the La Tours had vacated. And this was not surprising. There was really no way that La Tour could hold this off while he remained ensconced at Jemseg. But then, shortly after, in August 1654, an English fleet sailing from Boston under the command of Major Robert Sedgwick suddenly showed up on the St. John River and attacked and seized Jemseg. So what was going on here? Well, it's a complicated story, but basically Sedgwick was acting as a privateer with a commission from the Oliver Cromwell regime in England. And his commission was to attack the Dutch because there was a war on between England and the Netherlands. England was supposedly at peace with France, but, they still were kind of low-level enemies and distrusted each other. So when Sedgwick set out to attack New Netherlands, before he could carry out the attack, peace was concluded, ending the war between England and the Netherlands. So Sedgwick said, what the heck, I've got all these men and weapons, why don't I just sail up and attack the French? So he showed up and raided and ransacked Port-Royal. He killed one of the Capuchin friars there. He then left the town in charge. He didn't have enough men to permanently occupy the town, so he left the town in charge of a council of local notables, basically collaborators. Now, as for back on the mainland, La Tour survived the capture of Jemseg. He was not killed, but his regime was left in shambles. So now, ever the opportunist, La Tour sailed across to England and approached the Cromwell regime and offered a deal. And in this deal, the English would give La Tour a share of the ownership in Acadia, but the English would appoint an English governor named Thomas Temple. And so this is what happened. And in 1657, Thomas Temple arrived and took up command of the colony. And he soon bought out La Tour's rights to his shares in the colony, and La Tour quietly now retired to his estate at Cap Sable. So Temple governed Acadia as an English colony for the next 13 years, but he ruled very indirectly from Boston, rarely going to Acadia, and he dispatched minor officials and commandants to Port-Royal and some of the outlying forts. Now, in this period of 13 years under English rule, there was some return of peace and security. Some villages that had been ransacked or burned were rebuilt. Migration from France was halted. So the new migrants to the colony were very few, basically only a few merchants and traders from New England who mainly settled at Port-Royal. The population did not grow much at all or even slightly dwindled, and as of 1670, the colony had only about 400 European settlers. Trade did resume, but not with France, nor even with French Canada, but rather with New England, which was closer, easier to access almost year-round, and had a growing market. So the colonists traded mainly with New England merchants based in Boston, whom the Acadians called les Bostonnais. And the Acadians also sometimes traveled to Massachusetts, and Massachusetts fishermen often fished around Nova Scotia and landed and encamped on the shores to dry their catch. So during this time, socially and politically, Acadia was drawn closer and closer to New England. Some Acadians began to learn English. The Protestant religion had always been present in the colony, mainly in private, but now it was openly tolerated and supported. And also, the system of landholding changed significantly. So the old manorial practices were abandoned. Seigneurs no longer extracted rent and services from tenants. And tenants were now understood to own their small holdings outright, like free yeomen did in England under English common law. So all in all, this was a fairly successful venture of sort of adjusting Acadia into the English sphere. But still, there were some significant challenges and threats to English power and control over the colony. So some French colonists at Port-Royal had refused to accept the English takeover and had fled upriver and continued to hold out inland against English authority. Also, Nicolas Denis in the north still held out as basically an independent force, and Emmanuel Le Borgne and the creditors still kept harassing the coast effectively as privateers. So the English could never really completely consolidate their control until in 1667, England and France concluded the Treaty of Breda, which stipulated that England would hand Acadia back over to the French. Now, Thomas Temple in Port-Royal threw up obstacles and delayed the actual handover for 3 years. So it was not until 1670 that Temple finally allowed a handover of control. And this led to what you could call the High French period in Acadia in the next 25 or so years. So the French sent a new governor named Hector de Grandfontaine, who trekked with a small retinue overland from Quebec into present-day Maine and took up command of the colony, now headquartered at Pontargout. And Acadia was proclaimed a French crown colony, no longer governed, even in theory, through this Compagnie de l'Acadie. Grandfontaine appointed a French officer named Saint-Castin as the military commander of the fort at Pontargout, and in time the village around Pontargout grew and came to be called, as I said before, Castine, and still exists today. In 1671, the French started to take the colony very seriously as strategically valuable enough to invest in. For the first time, they conducted a census, and this found 392 European colonists. Most of them, by this point, had been born within the colony to French parents that had migrated early on in the 1630s and 40s, and in some cases also to indigenous women who married European men and resettled in the French settlements. It only counted Europeans in the main settlements, or people, Métis people living in these European settlements. It ignored the remote trading and fishing outposts, like in the far north, and the Métis villages and clans around the colony. So, this number of 392 really is an undercount. But still, it did show that the colony was minuscule compared to New England or Virginia or even French Canada. So starting at this time, France began to seriously throw money and resources into developing the colony, including to recruit peasants, laborers, and artisans, both men and women, to voyage to the province and settle and cultivate more land. And this started right off in 1671 with the first ship launching from La Rochelle with 50 migrants bound to Acadia. These were followed by hundreds more from all over western France, including Brittany, Poitou, and Anjou, and also some migrated of their own initiative from French Canada. Many marriages were made, and women in the colony tended to marry in their 20s and to have large families. The average, it seems, was about 5 children for each married woman, and up to 10 or 11 was normal as well. Most children, it seems, lived. Child mortality was only about 25%, which was, sounds terrible to us, but that was a lot better than in Europe at the time or among the indigenous people in America. And this is probably largely because this population was fairly protected by their own immunities and by the harsh winters. They were protected from crowd diseases like smallpox or malaria. So natural increase in population quickly took hold. Through the 1670s and early 1680s, the population grew significantly. Port-Royal alone increased to over 500 people, and good arable lands close to Port-Royal were increasingly occupied, and very few wanted to farm in the more rugged uplands. So groups of colonists, especially younger colonists from Port-Royal, started to hive off and to create new settlements, mainly to the northeast in the northern and central parts of Nova Scotia. So firstly, it seems a prosperous merchant and shipbuilder in Port-Royal named Jacques Bourgeois sold his holdings in that town and led a small company up to an inlet at the far northern tip of the Bay of Fundy at a site that they called Beaubassin, or the Beautiful Basin. And the advantages of this site were, for one, the strategic location. So this basin juts into the strip of land that links Nova Scotia to the mainland, which is called the Isthmus of Chignecto. And in fact, the narrowest point of this isthmus is about 15 miles wide, and it's between Beaubassin to the south and a small inlet of the Gulf of St. Lawrence called Baie Verte, or the Green Bay, to the north. And this narrow passage could be crossed on foot or on horseback. So this site was really ideal, both for farming and for control of trade over land and water. And the outposts at Beaubassin and Baie Verte became the main arteries for trade and travel between Canada and Acadia, which was increasingly important as Canada grew quite large. And the site also is surrounded by marshes, which the colonists could drain to make fertile farmlands, and beyond that by hilly uplands, which were good for grazing and for fruit orchards. And it seems that an Irish colonist named Roger Casey, or Roger Casey, brought fruit trees to plant at Beaubassin. So the settlement there grew quickly, such that by 1686 it became a significant town with a parish church. And Beaubassin also began to spawn then more small settlements and outposts farther to the west, up the Petit Kodiak and Memramcook rivers, leading into the interior of the mainland. So in the early 1670s, the colony was growing rapidly overall, but this growth was disrupted for a time in 1674, when this time a Dutch privateer named Julian Arseneault, with his ship called the Flying Horse, sailed up from New England and attacked and captured Pontarlier, which was the nearest fortress outpost down closest to New England and also the colonial capital. And again, Arseneault, although he was able to overcome the defenders, he did not have enough men to actually occupy the fort, so he sailed on and did the same thing to the fort at Jemseg, and then crossed the bay and raided and plundered Port-Royal. So after about a year, the French returned and retook the town. And Saint-Castin, for his part, rebuilt and secured Pontarlier partly by making an alliance with the Abenaki tribe, which he sealed by marrying the daughter of an Abenaki chief. So you can see him as echoing the actions and strategies of La Tour decades earlier, of securing this fortified outpost and sealing an alliance with the native people by a marriage. Now, this brief disruption from the Dutch did not stop the growth and expansion of the colony permanently, and if anything, it only further encouraged and hastened the exodus northward from Port-Royal to these more remote and hopefully secure sites farther to the north. And the next big destination after Beaubassin was the lands around the Minas Basin. So at the far eastern tip of the Bay of Fundy, jutting into the middle of Nova Scotia, is a large protected tidal basin, which French scouts had called the Bassin des Mines, meaning the basin of mines, because they thought that it had mineral deposits. And this Bassin des Mines in English is now called the Minas Basin. And these supposed mineral deposits turned out to be nothing. But the basin was surrounded by a broad, low, flat littoral with marshlands, woods, and wide meadows. And in 1680, an English Acadian colonist, Peter Melanson, or Pierre Melançon, as they called him in French, he led a party from Port-Royal northward to found a settlement at a site on the southern shore of the Bassin des Mines, which they called Grand Pré, or the Great Meadow. And this town grew quickly, much like Beaubassin, and it became a launching point again for other parties to found more settlements in all directions around Grand Pré. So to the west, near the mouth of the Minas Basin, was Rivière-au-Canard, or the Duck River. To the southeast, up a river called the Avon, was Pijiquid, meaning the confluence in the Mi'kmaq language. And directly to the east, at the far eastern end of the basin, was Cobequid, meaning the end of the bay. And this really was just a long string or cluster of homesteads and outposts along the eastern end of the Bassin des Mines. And the seigneurie over this area was granted to a colonist named Mathieu Martin, who was a weaver in his 40s from Port-Royal, and he was sort of a special honored person in the colony because at least he was said to be the first colonist born in Acadia. So you now see a native-born colonial population emerging into leadership. And all of these settlements around the Bassin des Mines enjoyed some success, but Grand Pré in particular grew most dramatically, such that by 1685 it could almost rival Port-Royal as the biggest town in the colony. Also, over the course of the 1680s, more seigneuries were granted for more far-flung areas to the north and west to encourage settlement, including at Miramichi and Restigouche in the far north of New Brunswick on the shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, at Mapakit up the St. John River, which this one was granted to Jeanne de la Tour, the métisse daughter of Charles de la Tour and his indigenous first wife. But as we said, these seigneuries were different now. The old manorial idea on the French model could no longer be reimposed, especially after Acadians had been exposed to the English system. So the seigneurs really were no longer lords in any real sense. They were just prospectors and land dealers who were able to sell to smallholding settlers who then operated as independent yeomen. So the colony overall, by the end of the 1680s, it seems it had a bit over 1,000 colonists, maybe about 1,300, and these were scattered in villages and outposts among their indigenous allies. It had fairly little commerce with France. This was at best irregular and was vulnerable to piracy. So the Acadians instead relied on, firstly, trade with New England, which was technically illegal at this point, now that they were once again a French domain. But it carried on nonetheless, right? The French authorities would call it smuggling, but it was basically tolerated. New England was much nearer and could conduct trade with the Acadians more safely and efficiently. The Acadians obtained from the English goods like iron tools and cookware. And secondly, they relied on their own handicrafts and small industries. So colonists made buildings and furniture from local timber, wove cloth from wool and flax, and made homemade candles and brewed their own beer. And they became increasingly self-sufficient in many respects. And this can be seen then as setting conditions for another era. As the High French period passes, we see the beginning of what you could call an Acadian era, with the coalescence of a more distinctive Acadian colonial or provincial way of life, with its own distinct customs, lifeways, and institutions. So as we mentioned before, there were large families. People tended to marry at a mature age in their 20s to known neighbors or to newcomers from France, and then they would have many children. So 6 to 10 was common, sometimes even 20. But also these newly formed married couples and families would tend to stay together with either the husband's or wife's father, thus forming large multi-generational households under one paterfamilias. And these large households or extended families would work together as teams in cultivating the land. Neighbors also would often cooperate in small village units. And households could have some marks of status, right? Everyone was not perfectly equal, and this could include holding more land or holding a seigneurial title. But generally, these households and families were regarded as broadly equal, much like in New England, right, where there was a general understanding of social and legal equality, even as certain families, like with ministers, could be higher status. They tended to be very independent. The colony had weak centers of authority. Disputes were usually worked out privately according to social norms and standards, and official authority was viewed with skepticism or even outright contempt. In matters of religion, the firm majority of the colonists were Catholic, but Protestantism was widely known and practiced as well. And even among Catholics, there was a very small number of clergy, which led to some lay-led worship practices, such as a custom called the White Mass, whereby colonists would gather together in a church or chapel, and a lay elder would lead prayers and hymns in a call and response style. And this can be seen to sort of resemble Protestant worship, but it also worked well for a population that was largely illiterate, right? This would be carried on orally, and perhaps the lay elder leading it might have a prayer book or a Bible. And this was basically tolerated by the Catholic clergy because there just weren't enough priests to lead Mass in all of these far-flung churches and chapels. Now, as for literacy, it seems that, the people were largely illiterate, but sometimes some individual students were taught by clergy or by local notaries in the various villages, and schools began to open too in this period. So in Port-Royal, a school for boys was opened in the late 1670s, followed in the 1680s by a school for girls run by nuns. Now, much later in the 1880s, a French scholar named Moreau de Saint-Père wrote the first scholarly history of Acadia using many primary documents, and he described the customs and lifeways in the villages, especially in Grand Pré in the late 1600s. So he wrote of the Acadians in this period, quote, "They enjoyed simple domestic pleasures as well as violent horse races and adventurous fishing expeditions. They liked the activity of church feast days, the processions and the solemn hymn singing that seemed to mingle with the ocean's beat. At parties, old French songs would be heard as well as recitals of hunting experiences and pirate sagas." End quote. So again, he may be using a little poetic imagination here, and we have to take this with a grain of salt, but this might be a pretty good approximation of what life was like in these villages based on Saint-Pére's documentary research and oral traditions, which have, remained strong in the Acadian community through the centuries. So Moreau de Saint-Père depicts social life in these villages as vibrant and rich, but he emphasizes that the towns themselves were also quite makeshift, largely because they needed to be able to abandon and withdraw in case of war or raids, which, as we've seen, came repeatedly off the sea from the English, the Dutch, and fellow Frenchmen in political feuds. So Saint-Père writes about these villages, quote, "The homes were built of squared logs or heavy beams planted in the soil with the interstices sealed with moss and clay. Chimneys were formed with poles and hardened clay. The roof was covered with rushes, bark, and even sawed at times. Wood being in abundant supply, the houses were easy to build, and if disaster struck, just as easily abandoned and lost without much regret. An important consideration, because of the frequent incursions of the English, led to a certain indifference, and they therefore endeavored to leave nothing of value to the enemy. When the latter appeared in force, the settlers fled to the woods." End quote. So one can say that arguably back in the English-controlled period in the 1660s, the colony had begun to diverge from France and become a distinctive provincial society. Now in the 1670s and 80s, although the links with France were reestablished, nonetheless, more and more people were born and raised in the colony and took on a set of customs and lifeways influenced by the indigenous people and also by the English. And there are documents from this time where French officials called the people of the colony the Creoles, which is not a racial term, right? This is a confusion for Anglo-Americans. It is not about color or ancestry. Creole comes from the root to create, and it refers to denizens that are born or created in a colony. And this use of the term Creole in these French documents, it signifies that the Acadians were starting to be regarded as a distinct new people of the colony, right? Not French, not English, but Acadian. Now, this newly developing society would then come under dramatic threat again due to a series of tumultuous diplomatic reversals in Europe. So in 1686, the kings of England and France concluded a Treaty of Whitehall, and this was negotiated by two kings who were fairly friendly, almost unofficial allies, so Louis XIV of France and James II of England. So their two countries were very competitive, especially over the overseas colonies, but they had shared religious priorities. Both of these kings were Catholic, and both were concerned about possible opposition or restiveness from their Protestant subjects. So Louis XIV was a Catholic king, and he had just revoked the Edict of Nantes, which provided toleration for Protestants in France. And he was trying to procure the conversion of these Protestants to Catholicism, but what he was finding was that more of them were emigrating. Now, in England, James II was a Catholic king over a mostly Protestant country, and he wanted to lift restrictions on Catholicism and to bring English Catholics back into power in civil society and government. So James and Louis decided that even though they could not really be outright allies, they agreed to avoid conflict as much as possible and to stay out of each other's way in the colonies. So according to this Treaty of Whitehall from 1686, quote, "Their colonies in America shall continue in peace and neutrality." Now, this peace with England, in theory at least, allowed leeway for further expansion of the Acadians to the southwest. And in 1690, the French granted more seigneuries at Passamaquoddy at the mouth of the St. Croix River, at what's now, of course, the border of Maine and New Brunswick, and at Ile Mont Désert, or Mount Desert Island, further down the coast of Maine. And the French might have expected now to see more waves of settlement at these sites and a further extension of the peace, prosperity, and growth that the colony had seen in the 1670s and 80s. But this did not end up happening. So what threw a wrench in the works here? Well, by the end of 1688, in England, Parliament had revolted against King James II, and James had fled from England to France, and rival Protestant claimants to the throne, William and Mary, had been invited into England with the support of Parliament and taken up power in England. Now, even this might not necessarily have affected conditions in Acadia in any direct way. So William and Mary were too busy consolidating their power at home in England and Ireland to want to get into any struggles with France in the colonies. But at the same time, in late 1688, Louis XIV of France invaded lands in the Rhineland in the Holy Roman Empire to his east, trying to gain territory and secure his position in Germany. So Louis is causing conflict on the European continent. And in response, several rival states in continental Europe joined together to try to contain and roll back the French expansion into Central Europe. And they formed a so-called League of Augsburg. So the new king in England, William of Orange, he was from the Netherlands, and he was a longtime bitter enemy of France and of Louis XIV. And by late 1689, William and Mary had pretty securely taken the English throne and control of Britain and Ireland, but they knew now that the main threat to their rule was French support for the deposed James II, whom the French might help to try to retake the throne in England. So hence, in December 1689, the English under William and Mary now signed an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor and joined into the war against France on the side of the League of Augsburg. So, as of the start of 1690, the colonists learned that once more France and England were at war. And over the course of the winter, the governor of French Canada, named Lord Frontenac, launched raids on 3 English frontier settlements in New York and New England. And after this, the English colonists wanted revenge, so they resolved to strike back. But striking against Canada was not so easy. Acadia was a closer and easier target. So in May 1690, an English fleet under the command of William Phipps set sail from New England, and on the 19th of May, this fleet appeared at Port-Royal with 400 men, and they easily overwhelmed and disarmed the tiny French garrison. They summoned the men of the village into the church, where they were forced to take oaths of allegiance to the King of England, and they took the governor, the parish priest, and some French soldiers prisoner. They then proceeded east and attacked and captured the fishing villages of La Hève and Chedabuctou on the Atlantic coast. Then, really feeling his oats, Phipps decided to sail on to try to take Canada. But he was repulsed by the French under Lord Frontenac, and he lost a number of ships. So then he withdrew from Canada, and on his way back eastward, he destroyed the remote Acadian outpost at Percé on the Gaspé Peninsula, but then limped on and headed home to New England. So in the fall of 1690, the English formally proclaimed Acadia to be an English province once again, and they sent an English governor, Edward Tyng, to take up command at Port-Royal. In the following summer, in 1691, Lord Frontenac in Canada sent an officer named Villebon into Acadia to counterattack. And Villebon joined forces with Saint-Castin from Pontarlier and his Abenaki allies, and they jointly attacked and retook Port-Royal. They then expelled the English and re-established French control through the rest of the colony. The only remaining English holdout in Acadia was the outpost of Pemaquid on the modern-day coast of Maine, west of Pontarlier, near the Kennebec River. So it was really west of any French strongholds, but still within the sphere that the French considered to be their territory. 4 years later, the French finally launched an expedition to take the English fort at Pemaquid, and it fell to the French on August 14th. So all of Acadia was now once again under French control. But in retaliation, the English launched a party of 550 colonists and Indian allies under Colonel Benjamin Church to invade Acadia. In September, they sailed up the Bay of Fundy and made a surprise attack on Beaubassin at the far northern end of Nova Scotia in an area that had been thought to be relatively safe. After 9 days of occupation and looting, the English torched most of the houses and the church, and they began to destroy the crops and livestock. Most of the residents of Beaubassin fled and took refuge in the woods and with the indigenous people. This was a huge blow to the small colony, of which Beaubassin by this point was probably the second largest village. Church then proceeded west and attacked outposts on the mainland west of the Bay of Fundy, culminating with the fort at Jemseg. But here Church's party was finally defeated, taking catastrophic losses, and had to withdraw back to New England. The following winter, the English prepared to escalate massively, striking once again with the aim, as they said, of expelling all of the French from Acadia. But at sea, French fleets and privateers were actually performing surprisingly well against the English in, the naval arena where the English usually dominated. And so English men and resources were diverted away, until in September 1697 the war ended with the Treaty of Ryswick. And under this treaty, the French secured sovereignty over all of Acadia, and even over other disputed territories to the north in Newfoundland and Hudson Bay. So this treaty led to another period of peace and partial recovery. Some refugees from Beaubassin returned and started rebuilding the village, and some also ventured slightly westward to Chipody, near the next inlet westward on the Bay of Fundy. But this time of recovery was very brief. It only lasted 5 years before a succession dispute in Spain led to another European conflict, and by 1702, England and France were at war again. And it was this war which would ultimately split Acadia in two, creating a permanent rupture, which would change the Acadians' role and destiny in the world. And hopefully we will get to that later, but first I will go through more important early colonies, including Virginia and French Canada. And it's yet to be determined which one will come first, since they emerged almost simultaneously. But if you want to hear that, and if you want to hear patron-only lectures, including my recent one on Central Africa, please sign up as a patron at any level. Thank you.